In the summer of 1972, in a quiet part of Washington state, a young woman began a familiar journey that no one could have imagined would become the final moments of her life. On the morning of 23 August, Jody Gwen Loomis left her home in Edmonds and headed towards a horse stable near the Mill Creek area. For her, it was simply a routine trip. Jody loved horses, loved the feeling of freedom she found on familiar roads, and never imagined that something ahead would change everything. But she never came home. As time passed and Jody failed to appear, her family began to realize something was wrong. The sense of normality quickly gave way to concern. A journey that was expected to last only a short time had become a troubling mystery. Those closest to her began asking questions they never thought they would have to face. What happened to Jody on that road? Who was the last person to see her? And what happened in the final moments before every trace of her disappeared? The search that followed led to a heartbreaking discovery. A young woman only 20 years old would never have the chance to continue writing the story of her life. A family lost the daughter they loved. A community that once believed it was a safe place was forced to confront a case that would remain with them for generations. The years that followed passed in silence. The investigation into Jody Loomis's death gradually became one of Washington's most recognized cold cases. Many questions remained unanswered. Many people believed that the identity of the person responsible for the tragedy might remain hidden forever. But a forgotten case does not mean a story has ended. Because behind the old files, the preserved evidence, and the memories that never faded, the truth was still waiting to be discovered. In today's episode, we return to the case of Jody Loomis, a story that lasted nearly 50 years, a determined search for justice, and a journey to uncover the mystery that kept Washington waiting for decades. If you enjoy true crime stories about cold cases, unsolved mysteries, and investigations that span across generations, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to join us for more episodes. Before becoming the name associated with one of the longest-running cold cases in Washington state, Jody Gwen Loomis was simply a young woman living an ordinary life like anyone else. Born on June 1952, Jody grew up in Edmonds, Washington, a community near the Puget Sound region, where many families sought a peaceful lifestyle away from the noise of larger cities. In the early 1970s, Edmonds still maintained the character of a small town, where neighbors often knew one another, and familiar streets created a sense of safety for local residents. At the age of 20, Jody was entering a new stage of adulthood. She had close relationships, plans for the future, and the simple things that gave meaning to everyday life. Those who knew Jody remembered her as a young woman with a special love for horses. For her, caring for and riding horses was not just a hobby, but also a way to find comfort, independence, and a sense of freedom. The horse stable near the Mill Creek area was a familiar place for Jody. Her trips there had become part of her regular routine. The route she took on the morning of 23 August 1972 was not unfamiliar. It was a path she had traveled before, a journey connected to the habits and passion of a young woman who loved horses. Jody's family could never have imagined that such an ordinary day would become the most painful moment of their lives. To those who loved her, Jody was not simply a name in an investigation file. She was a daughter, a sister, and a member of a family with memories that could never be replaced. At that time, no one in the Edmonds community believed that a serious crime was about to occur. The roads around the Mill Creek area continued operating as they always had. People went to work, children went to school, and daily life continued at its familiar pace. But within a short period of time, that sense of peace was shattered. The name Jody Loomis, once belonging to a young woman who loved riding horses, became connected to a case that would remain in the memory of many generations across Washington. Behind the legal documents and investigative reports that would later define the case, there was first a real person, a 20-year-old woman who had dreams, simple joys, and a future that should have stretched far ahead. And then, on that fateful morning in late August 1972, the familiar journey to the horse stable began just like any other day. But what happened along that road would lead to a case that remained unresolved for nearly half a century. But the familiar journey to the horse stable at the end of August 1972 became a heartbreaking turning point, marking the beginning of a cold case that would remain unsolved for nearly half a century in Washington state. In the days before the tragedy, Jody Loomis was still living the familiar routine of a 20-year-old young woman. She spent time with her family, maintained close relationships, and continued pursuing her deep passion for horses. For Jody, the trips to the Mill Creek area were not just part of her daily routine, but also a chance to enjoy the peace and sense of freedom that came with being around the animals she loved. The morning of 23 August began like many others before it. There were no signs that anything unusual was about to happen in Jodi's life. She prepared to leave home with a familiar plan: travel to the horse stable, spend time caring for the horses she cherished, and then return home. Her family believed it would be an ordinary day. Conversations, future plans, and simple moments shared together still held the same meaning as always. No one could have imagined that morning would be the last time they would see Jodi living her everyday life. Along the route towards Mill Creek, everything appeared normal. The roads around Edmonds and the surrounding areas still carried the quiet atmosphere they were known for. To Jodi, it was simply a familiar path leading to a place she visited regularly. She had no idea that ahead of her was an event that would bring her life to a permanent end. When Jodi failed to arrive at her destination as expected, concern began to grow within her family. The waiting period stretched longer than usual. Questions slowly began to emerge as no one could reach her or determine where she was. Worry quickly replaced the sense of normality from earlier that day. Her loved ones began searching for information, hoping that Jodi had only experienced a minor problem along the way. However, what happened next would lead them to a far more devastating reality. That seemingly ordinary summer morning ended with a discovery that shocked the entire Edmonds community. The road Jodi had traveled many times before became the starting point of an investigation that would continue across multiple generations. From that moment on, the biggest question was no longer why Jodi had not returned, but what had happened to her during those final moments on that road. From that moment on, the biggest question was no longer why Jodi had not returned, but what had happened to her during that final journey. The morning of 23 August 1972 began with the familiar quiet of the Edmonds area. Jodi Loomis left her home as planned, preparing for her trip to the horse stable near Mill Creek. It was a route she had traveled before, a journey connected to a passion that had been an important part of her life for many years. There were no suspicious phone calls, no warning signs that danger was approaching. To those around her, Jodi was simply carrying out an ordinary activity that was part of her routine. After leaving home, she traveled in the direction of Mill Creek Road. At the time, the area still contained large stretches of open land, quiet roads with little traffic, and wooded areas surrounding the landscape. That isolation meant the location initially attracted little attention during the early stages of the investigation. The moments that followed remain one of the biggest unanswered parts of the case. The only thing known is that Jodi was unable to complete the journey she had planned. Somewhere along the road towards the horse stable, she encountered a situation no one could have predicted. The life of that 20-year-old woman was changed forever within a very short period of time. When Jodi failed to arrive as expected, concern began spreading among her family. Those who knew her routine realized something was wrong. A trip that should have taken only a limited amount of time continued far longer than expected, leading them to begin searching for answers. News that Jodi was missing quickly spread. Those who knew her hoped that she had simply experienced a problem along the way, or that there was some explanation for why she had not returned. However, as the hours passed without any information, the uncertainty continued to grow. Authorities were eventually notified, and the search began. Not long afterwards, those involved in the search discovered something that completely changed the situation. The area near Mill Creek Road, once just another ordinary part of the local landscape, became the center of a serious criminal investigation. What was found there left those who arrived unable to comprehend what had happened. A day that had begun with peace and normality ended with an irreversible loss. From that moment forward, the case was no longer about a young woman who had failed to return home. It became an investigation into what had happened during Jodi Loomis's final hours and who was responsible for the tragedy that took her life. At that moment, the case was no longer simply about a young woman who had failed to return home. It became an investigation into what had happened during Jodi Loomis's final hours and who was responsible for the tragedy. When law enforcement arrived at the Mill Creek Road area, what they found confirmed that this was not a typical missing person case. The surrounding area was quickly secured to protect any evidence that might remain. For investigators, the first hours at a crime scene are always critical, as even the smallest details can become clues that help reconstruct what took place. Jodi Loomis was discovered deceased. Her body was removed from the scene for further examination, while forensic specialists began documenting every relevant detail. The location where the incident occurred was carefully examined in search of any evidence that could help determine what had happened beforehand. Investigators photographed the area, created detailed scene diagrams, and collected items believed to have potential value. Jodi's clothing, personal belongings, and any remaining traces at the scene were examined thoroughly. The initial autopsy findings revealed that Jodi had been sexually assaulted before her death. The cause of death was determined to be a gunshot wound to the head from a .22 caliber firearm. This discovery quickly transformed the case into a major homicide investigation. Alongside the physical evidence, Forensic experts also discovered biological material that could potentially be connected to the person responsible. In 1972, testing technology was not advanced enough to extract all possible information from these samples, but they were preserved as important parts of the case file. One of the most significant pieces of evidence was Jodi's boots. Traces found on them would later become a crucial part of the search for answers in the case. However, at the time, investigators had no way of knowing that these samples would play such an important role decades later. Beyond collecting evidence, police also began reconstructing Jodi's final movements. They needed to determine how she traveled, who she may have encountered before the incident, and whether anyone in the area had witnessed anything unusual. Those questions quickly became the center of the investigation. Who had been present along the route Jodi traveled? When did that person encounter her? And how was the offender able to leave the area without being noticed? In the days that followed, investigators began gathering statements from people connected to the case, examining every piece of information provided, and attempting to build a complete picture of that fateful morning. But despite the early evidence collected, the identity of the person behind the crime remained a major mystery. The answers everyone was searching for would not come that day. But despite the initial evidence that had been discovered, the identity of the person behind the crime remained a major mystery. The answer everyone was searching for would not emerge that day. After the scene was processed, investigators entered the most difficult stage of the case, identifying the person responsible for the death of Jodi Loomis. In 1972, law enforcement had to rely primarily on traditional investigative methods, including witness statements, information from the community, and reviewing individuals who may have been connected to the case. During the first days of the investigation, police focused on understanding Jodi's movements before her death. They worked to reconstruct the route she had taken, identify anyone who may have been near Mill Creek Road, and uncover any detail that could help explain the final moments of her life. However, the area where the incident occurred had very few direct witnesses. The isolated location made it extremely difficult to determine exactly what had happened. The information collected was not enough to identify the person responsible. Police continued expanding their search. They examined connections within the surrounding area, gathered information from local residents, and considered multiple possibilities. Every lead was carefully reviewed, but no evidence was strong enough to move the investigation towards a breakthrough. As time passed, the case began to reach a standstill. Jodi's family was left facing years of grief without receiving clear answers. They knew their daughter and loved one had been robbed of her future, but the identity of the person responsible for the tragedy remained beyond their reach. For investigators, this was also an exceptionally challenging case. Important evidence had been preserved, but the technology available at the time could not fully unlock its value. The traces left behind at the scene could not yet be transformed into specific information about the person responsible. Over the years, different generations of investigators continued to revisit the file. Old documents were reviewed, and previously recorded information was examined once again. However, the case still remained without a final resolution. Edmonds and Snohomish County watched the years pass while the same unanswered question remained. Who was responsible for ensuring Jodi Loomis never made it home that day? The 1970s came to an end. Then the decades that followed passed one after another. The investigators who first worked on the case eventually retired. Memories of the crime gradually faded within the community, but Jodi's case file remained preserved, waiting for a new opportunity to be examined. Nearly 5 decades after the tragedy occurred, the case remained among Washington State's unresolved investigations. No one knew whether the answer still existed somewhere within the evidence, or whether the person responsible for Jodi's death would ever be forced to face the consequences. Until advances in science began to change the way investigators viewed long-standing cold cases. For many years afterwards, the file surrounding Jodi Loomis's death remained preserved within the Snohomish County authorities. The case was never officially forgotten, but the distance between the day of the tragedy and the present continued to grow. The investigators who had worked on the original case gradually left the profession, and the memories of those early days spent searching for answers slowly faded with time. For Jodi's family, life continued while carrying a pain that never truly disappeared. They had to learn how to live without someone they loved, while still holding on to the unanswered question of what had happened on that summer morning in 1972. Over the years, different investigators took responsibility for reviewing the case. Old files were examined, and previously collected information was reassessed in the hope that even the smallest detail could reveal a new direction. However, those efforts were still unable to bring the investigation to a significant breakthrough. The greatest obstacle was the limitation of forensic science at the time. Evidence recovered from the scene still existed, but the ability to analyze and interpret it had not developed enough to identify the person involved. Important pieces of evidence remained within the case file, waiting for the right methods to unlock their true value. Time continued to pass. From the 1970s into the 1980s, and eventually into the new millennium, the Jody Loomis case gradually became one of the oldest unsolved cases in Washington state. For the local community, the story was not only about an investigation that remained unresolved, but also about a young woman who lost the chance to live her future and the family members who spent most of their lives waiting for answers. However, the case was never completely forgotten. The evidence collected during the original investigation remained preserved. Related documents continued to be stored within official records. Every small detail connected to the case held the possibility of becoming the key to unlocking the truth if science advanced far enough. By the 2010s, the field of forensic investigation began experiencing major changes. Experts gained access to modern tools capable of analyzing samples that had once been considered too difficult to examine. Cases that had appeared to reach dead ends were now being viewed from a completely different perspective. Nearly half a century after Jody Loomis lost her life, the question of who was responsible still remained unanswered. But for the first time in many years, investigators had a new path forward. The old evidence was about to be examined using new technology. And the search for answers in the Jody Loomis case was entering an entirely new chapter. The old evidence was about to be examined using new technology, and the search for answers in the Jody Loomis case entered an entirely different phase. As forensic science advanced in the years that followed, many cases that had remained unresolved for decades began to be viewed from a new perspective. Investigators were no longer limited only to witness statements, archived records, or information collected from the past. Evidence that had been carefully preserved over many years became a valuable source of data, offering the possibility of discovering clues that could not previously be identified. The Jody Loomis case was among those reviewed again. Investigators returned to the evidence collected in 1972. Among those items were samples that had been unable to provide specific information at the time because of the technological limitations of that era. Advances in biological analysis created a new opportunity for deeper examination, allowing experts to search for signs connected to the individual who had been present at the scene decades earlier. The major breakthrough came through DNA analysis, combined with genetic genealogy. Unlike traditional comparisons within criminal databases, this method allowed researchers to search for genetic connections through much broader family networks. From the initial results, investigators could develop new leads and gradually narrow the search to individuals who may have been connected to the case. For a case that had remained unresolved for nearly half a century like that of Jody Loomis, this represented a significant change. Evidence that had once been considered nothing more than old material from a closed investigation could now provide new information. Experts began analyzing the available DNA data while combining it with other factors, including residential history, age, and connections to the area where the crime occurred. The process was carried out carefully at every stage. Each DNA result needed to be independently verified to ensure that the investigative direction was based on reliable evidence. Authorities were not simply looking for a name. They needed to establish a chain of evidence strong enough to demonstrate a connection to the events of 1972. After years without meaningful progress, the Jody Loomis case began showing new signs of movement. Old records that had remained untouched in archives were now being connected with modern technology, creating a path that earlier investigators had never been able to follow. Nearly 50 years after her death, the case was finally moving closer to identifying the person responsible for the tragedy. The remaining evidence from the scene began pointing towards more specific connections. But turning scientific results into evidence that could stand in court required one more crucial step. Investigators needed to find the person who matched the genetic information they had uncovered and prove that the connection was not simply a coincidence. They had to identify a person who matched the scientific data they had obtained and prove that the connection was more than a coincidence. Based on the initial analysis results, investigators began narrowing down the search. This process did not happen quickly, as every piece of information had to be carefully examined before any conclusions could be reached. Through the use of genetic genealogy, experts traced family connections linked to the DNA sample preserved from the crime scene. This process allowed them to build genetic relationship networks and identify groups of individuals who could potentially be connected to the 1972 case. After combining scientific data with demographic information, residential history, and other relevant details, the investigation gradually turned its attention towards the Miller family in the Edmonds area. Among those considered, Terrence Miller became the most significant name. At the time of the incident, Miller had lived in Edmonds, the same area where Jody Loomis disappeared. This connection led investigators to conduct further verification steps to determine whether there was a link between him and the decades-old case. Experts did not rely solely on the genetic analysis results. They needed additional direct evidence to confirm whether the DNA profile preserved from the original investigation truly belonged to Miller. To complete the final verification, investigators began monitoring Terence Miller's activities. They searched for an opportunity to obtain a biological sample without interfering with the identification process. Later, police recovered a coffee cup that Miller had left behind. DNA collected from the item was sent for analysis and compared with the biological evidence preserved from the Jody Loomis case. The test results created a major breakthrough. The DNA obtained from the coffee cup matched the biological evidence connected to the 1972 investigation. Nearly 50 years after Jody's death, authorities finally had a direct connection between a specific individual and the case. For Jody's family, this discovery marked a significant turning point after decades of living with unanswered questions. For investigators, it represented the result of combining evidence preserved from the past with advances in modern forensic science. From a case that had remained untouched for decades, the investigation entered a new phase. Terence Miller was no longer simply a name being examined during the investigation, but the person who now faced allegations connected to the death of Jody Loomis. 47 years after the tragedy occurred, the investigation had finally reached its decisive moment. However, to bring the case to a conclusion, authorities still needed to take the next step, bringing the suspect before the justice system and completing the prosecution process. After 47 years since the tragedy occurred, the investigation had finally reached its decisive moment. But to bring the case to a conclusion, authorities still needed to take the next step, bringing the suspect before the justice system and completing the prosecution process. On 13 April 2019, Terence Miller was arrested in Washington state after investigators identified a connection between him and the Jody Loomis case. After nearly half a century without answers, the investigation finally had a specific suspect facing criminal charges in court. At the time of his arrest, Miller was 77 years old. He had lived in Edmonds in 1972, the same area where Jody Loomis disappeared. During the investigation, authorities stated that the evidence collected had established a direct link between him and the events that had occurred decades earlier. Following his arrest, Terence Miller was placed into the legal system while awaiting further proceedings. Prosecutors began preparing the case, reviewing all available evidence, including DNA analysis, results, historical investigative records, and documents connected to the investigation. The centerpiece of the prosecution's case was the biological evidence preserved from the scene in 1972. Investigators argued that the DNA match between Miller and the evidence collected in the case was a critical factor in establishing his connection to Jody Loomis's death. Alongside the scientific evidence, prosecutors also examined other details, including Miller's age, place of residence, and whether his personal history aligned with the circumstances surrounding the crime. Every element was carefully reviewed in an effort to build a strong case before it reached the courtroom. However, before a full trial could take place, the case took an unexpected turn. In 2020, while awaiting further legal proceedings, Terence Miller died by suicide. His death meant the criminal prosecution could not continue through the usual process, as the accused was no longer able to stand trial or receive a verdict. Despite this, the outcome of the investigation remained significant for Jody Loomis's family and law enforcement. After decades of searching, the identity of the person authorities believed was connected to the case had finally been established through the combination of modern technology and evidence preserved from the past. A case that once appeared to have no ending had finally moved closer to the truth. But behind that investigative breakthrough was also the story of those who waited for justice for decades, the losses that could never be undone, and the importance of uncovering the truth for Jody Loomis. But behind the outcome of the investigation lies another story, the story of those who waited for justice for decades, the losses that could never be repaired, and the meaning of finally uncovering the truth for Jody Loomis. Nearly 50 years after her death, Jody's family finally learned what they had been waiting to know for most of their lives. Although the legal process did not unfold through a traditional trial, identifying the person connected to the case still brought a significant change for those who had lived with that long-lasting pain. For the Loomis family, time could never bring Jody back. The years that were lost could never be recovered. But having the case finally explained gave them answers after decades of living with uncertainty and unanswered questions. Jody's story also became a powerful example of how criminal investigations have changed over time. Evidence collected many years earlier, once limited by the scientific capabilities of that era, eventually revealed its value when combined with modern forensic methods. The case showed that time can delay the pursuit of justice, but investigative efforts and the careful preservation of evidence can remain meaningful. A file that appeared to have been left in the past can still be reopened when the right tools become available. Jody Loomis was only 20 years old when her life was taken, at a time when she still had so much ahead of her. She is remembered not only through the case that lasted for decades, but first and foremost as a young woman who loved riding horses, had a family who cared for her, and carried dreams of her own. Today, Jody's name is often mentioned in discussions about cold cases solved through advances in forensic science. Her story serves as a reminder that behind every investigation file is a human life, and a family that continues waiting for the truth. After nearly half a century, the question that surrounded the case finally received an answer. Although the ending was not what many people had once hoped for, the search for the truth in Jody Loomis's case still carries a special meaning. It is a story about perseverance, the importance of evidence preserved through time, and the hope that remains for cases once believed to have no chance of being solved. Thank you for following the story of Jody Loomis. If you are interested in cold cases, historical mysteries, and investigations that span many years in the search for justice, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to join us for future stories. Every case we revisit is not only an investigation, but also a journey to uncover the truth for the people and families who have waited far too long.